Hi, it's Councilmember Jason Lyon, Pasadena District 7, back with another Pasadena in Perspective, our occasional look at how federal policy affects our city. This time, the constitutional showdown between the White House and the federal courts. If you've been following the news these past few weeks, you'll have no doubt read debates about the extent to which the country is in the midst of a constitutional crisis. But what is a constitutional crisis? Are we really in one? And what does it mean for Pasadena? This discussion requires a quick review of basic American civics, so if you're up to speed on our constitutional structure, you might want to skip ahead 30 seconds. Under the American Constitution, we don't have a single leader. We have three co-equal branches of government: the legislative, or Congress, the executive, or the president, and the judicial branch, that's the courts. The three branches have very specific duties assigned to each, but there is some overlap in their spheres of influence. If there's a first among equals under the Constitution, it's not the executive, but the legislative branch. It comes first in the Constitution, right up front in Article 1, and it's the branch with by far the most enumerated powers, including the power to tax the people, to make laws, regulate commerce, establish the rules of immigration, and to declare war, among others. The Congress is also the only branch empowered to remove the duly elected or appointed members of the other branches. It's not surprising that the founders placed so much authority in the legislative branch when you consider that they were just coming off a 7-year war to free themselves from what they considered to be the tyrannical rule of a unitary monarch. The legislature, as the only branch that is directly elected by the people, is also the most purely democratic of our institutions, and so the one entrusted with the most power. The executive, or president, is elected by the Electoral College, and that office has only 5 enumerated powers in the Constitution, and 2 of those require the advice and consent of the Senate. The president's strongest authority is over foreign relations and the power to pardon. The last branch is the judiciary, and its powers are the least defined. The Constitution just says the courts resolve controversies arising under the Constitution, laws, and treaties. Over time, it became clear that the judiciary is the branch that gets to decide what laws mean and whether they're consistent with the Constitution. It also has the power to order the other branches to comply with the law. So those are the 3 branches. A constitutional crisis emerges when 2 or more of the branches disagree about which has ultimate authority over a particular issue, and no branch is willing to accede to the other's authority. Since taking office in January, the executive branch has made moves to encroach on the powers of Congress by, for example, declining to honor funding measures it duly passed into law, and moving to repeal its actions in creating various departments. The executive is also purported to have the power to interpret the Constitution, which traditionally is a judicial power, by issuing an order refusing to recognize birthright citizenship, which is a principle established in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The majority in Congress has apparently been willing to concede their powers to the president, but the courts have generally insisted on enforcing the constitutional order. The crisis state emerged when the executive branch apparently defied a court order to pause an immigration enforcement action so that concerns about due process could be adjudicated. From its public comments, it appears that the executive branch was aware of the court order and just ignored it. That does present a constitutional crisis scenario. Fortunately, since then, the executive branch appears to have backed down for the moment and is following the normal judicial process of appealing the decision. But if the executive were to lose those appeals and then defy the court's orders, we'd go beyond the point of a constitutional crisis, where in theory the 3 branches are still trying to decide among themselves how to resolve the stalemate, and we'd be into the breakdown of the constitutional order. If the executive no longer considers itself bound by the other branches' exercises of their powers, we're outside the framework of the U.S. Constitution. And once we've invested in a single individual the power to decide what is permissible under the law, we're back in an autocratic state, just as we were 249 years ago when we declared independence and the Revolutionary War began. In America, the rule of law matters. And the rule of law requires that the 3 branches of government stay in their own lanes. So how does this impact Pasadena? Well, in the short term, we probably won't experience much besides the anxiety of looking at the headlines every day. It's in the longer term where the consequences of a breakdown of the rule of law are likely to be felt closer to home. Over time, if the executive branch exercises unchecked power, we know from other countries' experiences that we're likely to see that trickle down to figures at the top of other government hierarchies. So suddenly the governor of California decides he's not bound by the state legislature or the California Supreme Court. And of course, there are other less obvious effects of the breakdown of law and order. In other countries with autocratic rule, ordinary citizens begin to encounter abuses of power at all levels of government and a rise in corruption among individuals who are aligned with the dominant power structure. You see this in the need to bribe an official to get anything done, for example. Autocratic states also experience higher levels of crime in general, but especially violent crime. And perhaps most concerning, if the interpretation of the Constitution rests with one individual, you tend to see opposing voices silenced and an erosion of individual liberties for all citizens. Fear begins to dominate. So, for now, it's important that we all demand that our elected officials at every level of government respect the rule of law. As Chief Justice John Roberts pointed out, when the executive branch disagrees with a court order, our system already has a remedy built in. The executive has multiple opportunities to appeal the decision throughout the judicial hierarchy. Under our Constitution, that's the way disputes between the two branches are resolved. And that's the way they should be resolved if we want to maintain the ideal of a society where elected officials serve the people and not the other way around. As always, if you have any questions, email me at jlyon@cityofpasadena.net.